So Lady Louise Windsor just inherited a property that senior members of the royal family had been quietly fighting over for years. And the way it happened completely rewrites everything we thought we knew about who actually mattered to Queen Elizabeth. Wren's nest is this cottage buried so deep inside the Balmoral estate in Scotland that even staff couldn't easily find it. And the Queen gave it to the one grandchild that the institution spent decades treating like she barely existed. That is not an exaggeration. Charles didn't get it, and didn't get it. Andrew, who desperately needed a Scottish base after his entire life collapsed around him, didn't get it. Edward, Louise's own father, the man who spent his entire adult life trying to earn his place in this family, didn't get it. The Queen looked at all four of her children and said no. And then she handed the most private piece of the most private royal estate in Britain to a 22-year-old girl who had never once asked for anything. And the reason she did goes back to a bond that started forming years ago in ways that the senior royals are only now beginning to understand. And honestly, the fact that they didn't see it coming is almost as revealing as the gift itself. Before we get into any of that, though, if you're new here, subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss updates on stories like this one. Okay, back to it. So here's where it gets really dark. Because some of the people who got passed over for this cottage were not just disappointed, they were desperate. Andrew had already lost almost everything. His military titles were stripped. His HRH designation was pulled from public use. The Jeffrey Epstein scandal had burned his reputation completely to the ground. And he was sitting in Royal Lodge of Windsor under this grace and favor arrangement that was causing Crown ongoing political embarrassment basically every single week. He needed a base in Scotland. He had quietly hoped his dying mother would give him one, a place to breathe, a place away from the disaster his life had become. And she looked at him and said no. Then she looked at Edward, Louise's father, the youngest son who had suffered public humiliation after public humiliation trying to find a role the institution would accept, who had finally received his father's title, the Dukedom of Edinburgh, as his reward after decades of waiting. She looked at him too and said no. And then she gave it to his daughter, the girl nobody had expected to matter. If that doesn't tell you something about what the Queen actually thought about the people around her in those final years, I don't know what does. But you have to understand exactly what Wren's nest is to really feel what this decision meant, because this is not just some cottage. Balmoral itself is already a sanctuary. The Queen retreated there every single summer. She walked those hills. She picnicked by those rivers. She attended the little church at Crathy. And for a few months every year, she got to feel like a person instead of a monument. And within that already private estate, Wren's nest sat in the most secluded corner of all. This was the place the Queen went when she didn't even want Balmoral to see her. It was a retreat within a retreat. And the name is not an accident. In ancient British legend, the wren is the bird that defeated the eagle, not through size, not through speed, not through power. The eagle flew higher than any other bird and thought it had won. And then the wren, who had been hiding in the eagle's feathers the entire time, rose from the eagle's back and flew higher still. The smallest bird in the sky, the one nobody noticed. That bird won. The Queen called her most private refuge Wren's nest, and she gave it to her smallest, quietest, most overlooked grandchild. That is a message sealed in a document the rest of us may never be allowed to read, because royal wills are sealed for a minimum of 90 years. Everything we know about this inheritance comes from palace insiders who swear with everything they have that they're right. The full picture, the conditions the Queen may have attached, what she withheld from others, what her exact words were, all of it is legally locked away. We may never see it, not in our lifetimes, not in our children's lifetimes. The world is watching the edges of a dying woman's most private decisions, and the full truth is buried so deep it may never come out. Now, who is Lady Louise really? Because to understand why this inheritance is so shocking, you need to understand just how invisible she was supposed to be. She was technically born a princess, but her parents, Edward and Sophie, made a deliberate choice when she was born. They decided their children would be known as the children of an earl, not princes, not princesses. Lady Louise Windsor. That was it. No HRH, no title that would put her in the spotlight. And that choice honestly came from a place of fear. On November 8th, 2003, Sophie was rushed to Frimley Park Hospital in Surrey, but she wasn't supposed to be there yet. The baby wasn't supposed to come, but something went wrong inside her body. Her placenta suddenly tore away from the wall of her womb. And when that happens, the blood doesn't stop. It pours. Sophie was losing it fast. Doctors immediately cut her open. There was no other way to get the baby out in time. And what came out stopped the room. 4.5 pounds. That was all Louise weighed. 4.5 pounds of the most fragile human life you've ever seen. She was so small she barely looked real. The doctors wrapped her up as fast as they could and rushed her straight to a neonatal unit in London. While Sophie lay in a hospital bed, barely conscious, the people in that room didn't know if either of them would make it through the night. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Sophie, drifting in and out, barely holding on, moaned like a prayer, like the only thing left inside her. Save her. Save the girl. That was it. That was all she had. Edward was in Mauritius, thousands of miles away on an official trip. As soon as he heard the news, he stopped everything and immediately flew back to be with his family. But throughout that flight, something was eating him alive from the inside. Because the night before Louise was born, Edward had a dream. In the dream, someone came to him and presented him with a baby, and the baby was in a coffin. He woke up from that dream drenched in sweat, and just hours later, he got the call that his girl had been born but was fighting for her life. When Edward finally walked into that neonatal unit and saw Louise for the first time, this tiny, impossible creature with tubes and machines all around her, he broke completely. He had dreamed of a coffin, and here she was alive, barely, but alive. And every decision Edward and Sophie made about Louise after that carried the shadow of that night inside it. They had come so close to losing her that they couldn't bear the thought of the world getting anywhere near her. So they hid her lovingly, completely. They hid her from everything. But that protection came with a brutal cost. Because while Louise grew up quietly, her cousins were receiving everything the institution had to offer. Security, resources, global platforms, balcony appearances. William and Harry were the princes the world watched. Beatrice and Eugenie were the princesses the tabloids followed. Meanwhile, Louise, who had to live a normal life, was sitting on the floor of a crowded train with her laptop because there were no seats. Louise was working at a garden center, earning her own money. She was being called the most down-to-earth member of the family, which sounded like a compliment, but was really just a polite way of saying that the institution had never invested a single thing in her. She had nothing. No title that mattered, no platform, no safety net. And then the Queen died, and it turned out that this invisible girl had been quietly handed the most intimate piece of the most private estate in Britain. Now ask yourself, who knew about this? Who was fighting behind the scenes to make sure she got it? Because the answer to that question is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Two men stood between Louise and the chaos that could have swallowed this inheritance whole, and they were William and Lord Ivar Mountbatten. And to understand why they fought for her, you first need to understand what the Queen saw in Louise that made her make this decision in the first place. The Queen didn't give Wren's nest to Louise out of pity. She gave it to her because over the course of many quiet summers in the Scottish Highlands, she saw something in Louise that she had stopped expecting to find in anyone. The Queen had spent 70 years surrounded by people who wanted things from her. Status they needed confirmed, money they needed protected, approval they were desperate to receive. Even her own family came to her with agendas, conscious or not. That's what it means to be the most powerful woman in the world for 7 decades. You stop being a person to most people. You become a resource. And then there was Louise, who arrived at Balmoral every summer with walking boots and a sketchbook. While the adults around her argued about who would appear on the Buckingham Palace balcony, Louise never argued about the balcony. She never asked for anything. She just showed up and loved her grandmother, the way you love someone when you have no idea they're supposed to be more than just your grandmother. Sophie said it in a 2016 BBC interview. Louise used to come home from school confused because other children were telling her that her grandmother was a queen. To Louise, Queen Elizabeth was just grandma. That was it. She genuinely didn't know she was supposed to be awed. She didn't know she was supposed to keep a distance, or speak carefully, or perform the correct amount of reverence. She just loved her. And the Queen, who had been bowed to and formally addressed and kept at institutional distance by almost every person in her life, including her own children, felt that love like a light turned on in a room that had been dark for a very, very long time. Joe Little, the managing editor of Majesty magazine, explained the depth of their bond by pointing to Louise's birth. He said the Queen and Philip were shaken by how fragile Louise had been. She was a grandchild who had almost not existed. Every year she was alive was a year that could have been taken away in a Surrey hospital on a November night. That near loss never left the Queen's feeling for Louise. She looked at this girl and saw someone who had fought to be here without even knowing it. And then, in the Queen's final summers, something shifted. In 2019, 2020, and 2021, the Queen and Louise began spending long, private periods together at Balmoral that other grandchildren didn't share. This wasn't just family time. They were sorting through private papers together. The Queen was showing her things, telling her things, deciding things in her presence. And sources close to the family say it was during exactly these quiet sessions that the Queen made her decision about Wren's nest. She didn't do it in a lawyer's office. She didn't call a formal meeting. She sat in a room with Louise, with Scotland outside the windows, and she decided, and Louise didn't even know it was happening. Now compare that to how everyone else came to Balmoral in those final years. William arrived with Catherine and the children, with schedules and security details, and the full weight of future kingship pressing down on every hour. Harry came with the growing rupture that was pulling him further from the family every single visit, tension filling every room he walked into. Charles came as the heir, which meant he came as the next thing, the waiting king, the person everyone was already quietly preparing for. Nobody could be simply present. Nobody could sit still long enough to just be with her. Louise could. Louise did every summer. And here's the part that sealed it. Philip died in April 2021, and he left Louise his 2 ponies and his dark green 4-wheel carriage. The same carriage that carried his coffin at his funeral procession. That was the first inheritance. And what Louise did with it told the Queen everything she needed to know. She didn't treat it as a relic to be protected behind glass. She drove it at the Platinum Jubilee Royal Windsor Horse Show in 2022. She climbed into the seat of the carriage that had carried her grandfather's body, and she drove it publicly in front of thousands of people while the Queen watched from the stands. The Queen wept openly. This was one of her final public appearances. Louise used the family name Mountbatten Windsor at competitions rather than her title. She wanted to be treated like anyone else. Her trainer, Sarah Howe, said she was a joy to work with, someone who wanted to improve, not to impress. The Queen had spent 70 years watching people try to impress her. Louise never tried. Sources say this moment was a final confirmation. The Queen had been moving toward this decision for years, but watching that carriage move across the Windsor ground with Louise at the reins, she made her decision. She didn't give Wren's nest to the people who wanted it. She gave it to the one person who had never asked for anything. So that brings us back to William and Lord Ivar. William's involvement here wasn't generosity. It was grief turned into action. In those final Balmoral summers, the Queen didn't just sort papers with Louise. She walked with William too. And in those private walks on the Highland ground she loved more than any other place on earth, she said something to him that he has never publicly repeated. She told him she was worried about Louise because Louise was so quiet, so far outside the machinery of the institution, that once the Queen was gone, she might simply be forgotten. The family would move forward. Charles would become king. William would become Prince of Wales. The world would focus on the people the cameras were already pointed at. And Louise, the girl who had never demanded to be seen, would quietly disappear into the background. The Queen asked William to make sure that didn't happen. She asked him to watch out for her, and William said yes because he understood exactly what was being asked of him. William knows exactly what it feels like to be chosen by a dying woman. He was young when it happened to him. His mother had just died, and he was walking around with a hole inside him that nothing was filling. And then the Queen Mother, who was herself running out of time, looked at this broken young man and did something nobody expected. She gave him Temnagar, a piece of land on the Balmoral estate, Scottish ground, permanent, completely and quietly his. And what that felt like what actually meant to receive something that personal from someone that close to death. William has never been able to fully put into words publicly, but you don't forget something like that. You don't forget the moment a dying woman looked at you in all your grief and all your mess and decided you were worth trusting with something she could never get back. So when William stood in those same Scottish hills years later and watched Louise showing up summer after summer, something moved in him. He knew exactly what it looked like when an old woman chose someone, and he wasn't going to let that choice go unprotected. But William's reasons go deeper than all this, because William knows something about this family that most people only learn after it's too late. He knows what happens when you have no place to hide. William watched what happens to a person in this family when they have nowhere to hide. He watched it happen to his mother. Diana had no place where the cameras couldn't reach her. The press followed her everywhere, and she had nothing to retreat to. It tore her apart slowly, publicly, over years, until there was nothing left to tear. William swore he wouldn't let that happen to himself. So when he and Catherine married, he took Amer Hall, a manor house the Queen gave them on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, and turned into exactly that, a place with no public road access, a proper shelter built before the storm arrived rather than after. Wren's nest would be exactly that for Louise. Buried deep inside Balmoral, no press access, no public visibility, pure Highland silence. William knew the storm would come for her eventually. It comes for everyone in this family, and he wasn't going to let her face it with nowhere to go. Now, Lord Ivar Mountbatten, this is a part of the story that hits completely differently. Lord Ivar Alexander Mountbatten is Louise's godfather. He's a second cousin of King Charles. He's connected to Louise by blood, by ceremony, by decades of shared family life. In return for being her godparent, Edward is godfather to Ivar's daughter Ella, and Sophie is godmother to his daughter Alexandra. These two families are woven together across generations in every direction, spiritually, emotionally, completely. Lord Ivar knows exactly what it feels like to lose something you were trusted with. He inherited Moynes Park in 1992, then later moved to Bridwell Park in Devon. He poured everything into keeping alive, and in 2024, he had to sell it. That's not just a financial loss. That's the grief of receiving something precious from people who were gone and then failing to hold on to it, of feeling like the trust they placed in you slipped right through your hands. So when the question of Wren's nest came up, Ivar stepped all the way forward. He knew the financial weight of it. He knew the emotional weight of it. He knew that inheriting a historic property without the right support around you wasn't a gift. It was a trap waiting to spring, and he wasn't going to let her walk into it alone. But there's a second reason, and this one goes deeper than property. In 2016, Lord Ivar came out publicly. In 2018, he married James Coyle at Bridwell Park. It was the first same-sex wedding in the extended royal family. His ex-wife, Penny, walked him down the aisle. Their 3 daughters suggested it. It was an extraordinary, complicated, deeply human moment, and the response in the aristocratic world around him wasn't simple. Some people were warm. Others were visibly uncomfortable. The formal, tradition-bound circles that Ivar had moved in his entire life didn't always know how to carry what he had just told them about himself. He had spent decades hiding who he was, and then he finally lived honestly, and the world he lived in had to decide what to do with that. Louise was a teenager when he came out, and she responded with complete, uncomplicated, total love. She was one of the few people in his world who acted as though nothing had changed, because genuinely nothing had changed. He was her godfather. She loved him, full stop, for a man who had spent so long being something other than himself in public. That response broke something open in him. The gift of Wren's nest wasn't just Ivar fulfilling his duties as godfather. It was his answer to what she had given him. It was him saying, "You loved me when I was most exposed and most raw. You loved me when I had nothing to offer you except the truth of who I am. Now I will make sure you have ground under your feet that no one can take from you. Now I will fight for you the way you quietly fought for me without even knowing you were doing it." William brought a king's promise. Ivar brought a godfather's debt. Together, they made sure the Wren got the nest. But here's the thing that nobody seems to be talking about, and it's the part that could quietly unravel everything. Wren's nest is a gift that could destroy Louise if the wrong things go wrong. Lord Ivar sold Bridwell Park in 2024 because he couldn't afford to keep it. The man who was supposed to be guiding Louise through this couldn't hold on to his own property. He fought for years and still lost, and historic Scottish cottages on Highland estates don't maintain themselves. The cairngorms are brutal. The winters arrive early and hit hard. Damp gets into stone walls and destroys them from the inside. Roofs on old Highland properties need constant attention. Heating systems that can fight that kind of cold cost serious money to install and more serious money to run. This isn't a cottage you lock up and visit in summer. This is a living structure that requires constant, expensive care just to remain standing. And Louise has no royal income. She receives no funding from the sovereign grant. She holds no HRH title that would trigger institutional financial support. She's a 22-year-old student finishing her degree at St. Andrews, and she's been handed a piece of historic Scottish Highland property that costs a significant amount just to keep from falling apart. The Queen gave her the gift, but nobody has publicly committed to helping her keep it. That silence is the loudest thing in this entire story. Now, here's where it gets complicated in a different direction entirely. Sources describe Wren's nest as a wedding gift, and in royal tradition, that framing means something very specific. The Queen gave Amer Hall to William and Catherine in 2011 when they married. She bought Gackham Park for Princess and as a wedding gift. When a royal property is framed as a wedding gift, it's not just a present. It's a statement of expectation. It says, this is yours, and it's meant for something, for a family, for a future, for a continuation. Louise is currently linked to Felix de Silva Clamp, a fellow student at St. Andrews, the same university where William met Catherine. If Louise marries, Wren's nest becomes a marital home. A private cottage deep inside the Balmoral estate becomes a foundation of a new family branch. And if that marriage produces children, those children will hold a claim to a piece of Balmoral that no government decision can remove from them. Think about what that means. A branch of the family that was never supposed to matter, the branch that was raised without titles, suddenly has a privately owned foothold in the most sacred ground the British royal family possesses. 1 generation from now, Louise's children could own a piece of Balmoral, the invisible girl's children in the most private house in Britain. The Queen didn't do this by accident. This was strategy, which brings us to the final and perhaps most unsettling layer of this whole story. King Charles has stated publicly that he intends to slim down the working monarchy. Fewer working royals, a tighter, more focused core. Every member must justify their existence within the institution. The pressure on the small number of working royals is already immense, and it's only going to grow. Louise has joined the Tayforth University Officers Training Corps, part of the British Army. Photos of her in military gear, helmet-marked Windsor, have appeared in the Scottish press. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams has said she appears to share the temperament and values of both her grandparents and has raised the possibility of her taking on formal royal duties. She's finishing her English degree at the same university that produced the future Queen of England. She has military training. She has Philip's legacy in her hands. She has William's active support. She has Lord Ivar's guidance. And now she has a private base inside Balmoral. Wren's nest isn't just a home. It's a base of operations, a private press-proof, historically embedded anchor point for a young woman who is being quietly assembled into something the institution may very soon need her to become. The Queen didn't give Louise a cottage. She gave her a position. And she did it so quietly, so privately through a sealed document that the world may never read in full, that by the time anyone realized what had been given, it was already done. The girl nobody expected to matter has already been handed everything she would need for what's coming. She carries Wren's nest, the most private corner of the most private estate in Britain, the place where the Queen wanted to be no one but herself. Louise is now the keeper of that silence. Louise carries something she may not fully understand yet. She carries the Queen's verdict, the final sealed, unappealable answer to everyone who looked at this quiet, invisible, titleless girl and decided she didn't quite matter enough. She mattered most. She always had. She's a wren hidden in the eagle's feathers. She waited. She didn't push. She didn't demand. She just loved her grandmother, drew rabbits with small children, drove a funeral carriage without flinching, and sat on train floors without complaint while everyone else was fighting to be seen. She was simply present. And in the end, the one who was simply present received the one thing that all the fighting in the world could never have won: the nest